November 3rd, 1887, and the thermometer nailed to the post outside Ridgerest's land office read 12 degrees below zero before the sun had fully crested the Bitterroot foothills. The cold had arrived 3 weeks ahead of any reasonable expectation, settling over the valley like a predator choosing its ground. 243 souls called this Montana Territory settlement home, most of them ranchers and their families who had carved out lives from land that gave nothing freely. The old-timers gathered on the boardwalk outside the general store, breath freezing in their beards, speaking in low voices about how the snow smelled different this year. Heavier, crueler. By morning, the mercury would plunge to 28 below, and it would not rise above zero until March released its grip on the frozen earth. The killing winter had announced itself, and the valley was not ready. Up on the cliff face above Bitter Creek, where the sandstone caught the weak morning light and held it like a promise, a young woman of 19 stood at the mouth of a cave dwelling that had taken her 8 years to carve from living rock. Rosalind Ridgway pulled her wool coat tighter and watched the settlement below, where thin columns of smoke rose from cabin chimneys into the still, deadly air. Her buckskin mare, Willow, stood in the small corral she had built against the cliff, her coat grown thick as sheepskin, thicker than any year prior. The horse knew what was coming. The elk knew, having descended from high country 6 weeks early. The beavers knew, their lodges along Bitter Creek built with walls 3 times the normal thickness. Rosalind knew. She had tried to tell them. If you want to understand how a girl of 11 came to carve a home from stone while grown men laughed, you should subscribe and tap the notification bell so you do not miss how this story ends. 8 years earlier, in the spring of 1879, Rosalind Ridgway had arrived in Ridgerest with $17 in her pocket, a canvas sack containing her grandfather's surveying tools, and grief so heavy it had pressed all the tears out of her before she crossed the Mississippi. The stagecoach driver had looked at her twice, this silent child with eyes the color of Pennsylvania coal country slate, traveling alone with papers that declared her an orphan of the Commonwealth and a letter of introduction to a distant cousin who, upon her arrival, turned out to have died of influenza 3 months prior. The mine collapse that took her father and grandfather had happened on a Tuesday morning in February, when the earth itself seemed to shrug and settle, burying 47 men beneath 1,000 tons of Welsh anthracite. Rosalind had been at school when the whistle blew, the long, sustained note that meant disaster, and by the time she reached the pit head, her mother was already there, already keening, already knowing. Her mother lasted 6 weeks after the burial, her heart simply stopping one night as if it had decided there was nothing left worth beating for. The doctor called it grief. Rosalind called it abandonment, though she never said so aloud. But before all of that, before the collapse and the keening and the silent stopping of her mother's heart, there had been her grandfather Dafydd, who had spent 30 years studying how the earth itself could shelter the living. He had worked the mine since the age of 8, watching how some tunnels held and others fell, observing how the mountain breathed through cracks and fissures, learning to read stone the way other men read scripture. On Sundays, when the mines were closed and God supposedly rested, Dafydd Ridgway would take his granddaughter into the hills above their company town and teach her what he knew. Stone holds warmth longer than any timber, he would say, his Welsh accent thick as the black dust that never quite washed from his hands. A hillside properly carved becomes a fortress against any storm. You must listen to the rock, Cariad. It will tell you where it wants to break and where it wants to hold. He taught her about ventilation shafts, about the dangers of bad air pooling in low places, about how to angle a tunnel so water would drain rather than collect. He showed her the difference between sandstone and limestone, between shale that would crumble and granite that would defy any drill. He put tools in her small hands and showed her how to swing a pick with her whole body, how to set a charge so the blast would crack stone cleanly, rather than bringing down chaos. These were not lessons meant for a girl of 10, but Dafydd Ridgway had buried 3 sons in those mines, and knew that knowledge was the only inheritance the mountains could not take back. "Remember," he told her on their last Sunday together, 3 days before the earth swallowed him whole, "the mountain is not your enemy. It is your teacher. Learn what it offers, and you will never be cold, never be homeless, never be helpless." She was 11 years old when she stepped off that stagecoach in Ridgerest, and she remembered every word. The land office in Ridgerest was run by Hosea Calloway, a broad-shouldered man with a politician's smile and a speculator's heart. He had made his fortune buying land cheap from desperate settlers and selling it dear to hopeful newcomers, and he assessed the orphan girl standing before his desk with the particular contempt men reserve for those they intend to cheat. "You want to buy land," he repeated, as if she had said something in a foreign tongue. "You, a child, with what money?" $17, Rosalind said. "What will that buy?" Calloway laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. He pulled out a map of the territory marked with parcels colored to show their availability and value. The prime bottomland along Bitter Creek was shaded green. Taken. The good grazing land on the southern slopes was shaded blue. Expensive. But up on the cliff face, where the rock rose nearly vertical above the creek, there was a patch of uncolored emptiness. "That," he said, stabbing the map with a thick finger, "is worthless vertical waste. Cannot be farmed, cannot be grazed, cannot be built upon. I own it myself. Bought it for back taxes when the original owner gave up trying to make it useful." He smiled, showing teeth that had seen too much tobacco. "I will sell you 10 acres at $2 each. That will leave you with a piece of land only a goat could love, and enough money left over for a meal before you starve." Rosalind studied the map. She could see the contour lines indicating the cliff face, the south-facing exposure, the proximity to the creek below. She thought about what her grandfather had taught her, about how a hillside properly carved becomes a fortress. "I will take 5 acres, she said. $10. Hosea Calloway laughed again as he pocketed her dead father's savings. He was still laughing when he signed the deed over to her, and he told the story at the saloon that very evening, how the orphan Ridgway girl had bought herself a patch of vertical rock like it was going to sprout a cabin on its own. He would not be laughing for much longer. Now, friend, this next part shows you exactly how Rosalind turned that worthless cliff into something extraordinary. So make sure you subscribe now to see how her neighbors reacted. The first summer, Rosalind lived in a canvas tent pitched at the base of the cliff, earning money doing washing and mending for the ranchers' wives who needed the help, but would not invite her into their homes. The Calloway family had made certain everyone knew the orphan girl was strange, possibly touched in the head, certainly not the sort of respectable company one wanted around decent children. It did not matter. Rosalind needed their money, not their approval. By August of that first year, she had saved enough to purchase her first supplies: 2 hand drills at $1.75 each, a surveying level that cost her $3, and 6 pounds of black powder at $4 per pound. The merchant who sold her the powder looked at her as if she had sprouted antlers. "What exactly," he asked slowly, "does an 11-year-old girl want with black powder?" "Mining," she said, and offered no further explanation. She began with the entrance, choosing a spot on the cliff face where the sandstone showed the layered coloration her grandfather had taught her to look for, the bands of iron red and cream white that indicated good structural integrity. The rock here had been compressed by millennia of pressure, hardened but not brittle, the kind that would hold a carved shape without crumbling. She marked out a rectangle 6 feet high and 8 feet wide, Then began the slow work of drilling blast holes in a pattern designed to crack the stone inward rather than outward. The first blast brought half the town running, convinced the cliff was falling. They found Rosalind calmly shoveling rubble into a wheelbarrow, her face blackened with powder smoke, her eyes steady as the mountains themselves. "The Badger is digging herself a den," Hosea Calloway announced to the gathered crowd, and the laughter carried across the valley. The name stuck. By winter, everyone called it the Badger's Burrow, and they said it with the particular scorn reserved for those who refused to behave as expected. Rosalind did not care. She spent that first winter in the shallow cave she had begun, banking her fire against the back wall where the stone would absorb the heat and radiate it back through the night. She survived on rabbit stew and determination, and when spring came, she resumed her blasting. Year by year, the dwelling grew deeper into the hillside. She learned to read the rock as her grandfather had taught her, following the natural fracture lines where the stone wanted to break, avoiding the harder veins that would dull her drills and waste her powder. She created ventilation shafts by driving narrow holes upward through the cliff at angles, connecting them to the main chamber so air would circulate naturally without creating drafts. She channeled the natural spring she discovered in the back of the cave, directing its flow through a carved trough that kept fresh water available and maintained humidity without creating dampness. By the spring of 1884, when Rosalind was 16, the dwelling extended 23 feet into the hillside and contained 2 chambers, a main living space with a fireplace carved into the rock and vented through a natural chimney fissure, and a sleeping alcove that stayed warm even when the fire burned low. She had purchased her buckskin mare, Willow, by then, a steady-tempered creature with eyes the color of autumn honey, and built her a corral against the cliff face where the overhang provided natural shelter. By 1887, the year the killing winter came, the Badger's Burrow had reached its full extent. 3 rooms carved 40 feet into the sandstone, maintaining a constant 52 degrees regardless of the weather outside. The root cellar held 800 pounds of preserved vegetables, carrots and turnips packed in sand, potatoes in straw, onions braided and hanging from pegs driven into the stone walls. Smoked venison and elk hung from iron hooks driven into the ceiling of the cold room, where the temperature hovered just above freezing. The oak door at the entrance, fitted so precisely that no draft penetrated, had cost her $18 and 3 months of additional washing work to afford. The settlement below looked at her with the particular disdain reserved for those who insist on doing things differently. Patience Calloway, Hosea's wife, had organized the women's sewing circle to exclude the cave creature from all social functions, and when the new schoolteacher suggested Rosalind might assist with the younger children's reading lessons, Mrs. Calloway made certain that suggestion was never repeated. The general store began requiring Rosalind to pay cash in advance while extending credit to everyone else, a practice the owner justified by saying he could not be certain the Badger would survive long enough to pay her debts. When the preacher, a kind but weak-willed man named Reverend Aldridge, suggested that someone ought to check on the poor disturbed child living alone in that cave, Rosalind happened to be passing the church steps. She stopped, looked at the assembled congregation with those slate-gray eyes that seemed to see further than eyes should, and spoke the only word she would offer on the subject of her neighbors' opinions. "Let them talk," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The mountain listens better than they do." She walked on, her back straight, her steps unhurried, while the congregation whispered behind their hands and Hosea Calloway shook his head with theatrical pity. In October of that year, Rosalind observed the elk descending from high country. In a normal year, they would not abandon the upper meadows until mid-November at the earliest, but here they were, drifting down through the aspen groves 6 weeks ahead of schedule, their coats already thick as midwinter. She watched them from her cliffside vantage point, counting the herds, noting how they clustered together more tightly than usual, how the bulls seemed restless in ways that had nothing to do with the rut. She rode Willow down to the beaver lodges along Bitter Creek, dismounted, and spent an hour examining the structures the animals had built. Normal lodges had walls perhaps a foot thick. These walls measured nearly 3 feet of densely packed mud and sticks, as if the beavers knew they would need fortification against something unprecedented. Willow herself had grown an undercoat denser than any year prior, hair so thick that Rosalind's fingers disappeared into it when she groomed the mare. The horse stood patient and calm, but her ears swiveled constantly, tracking sounds that human ears could not detect, listening to warnings whispered in frequencies meant only for creatures wise enough to heed them. Rosalind told the blacksmith, a reasonable man named Henrik Joost, that the winter would kill. He listened politely, nodding in the way men do when they wish to end a conversation without rudeness, and then he told the story at the saloon that evening. The laughter echoed through the establishment like breaking glass. "The Badger thinks she is a prophet now," the dry goods merchant announced to general amusement. "Next, she will be reading fortunes in her cave, charging 2 bits to tell us all what the chipmunks are whispering." Rosalind heard about the mockery, as she heard about most things. The settlement was small enough that gossip traveled faster than weather. She did not respond. She did not argue. She simply returned to her cliff dwelling, checked her stores one final time, and spoke quietly to Willow as she rubbed the mare's thick winter coat. "They will learn," she murmured into the horse's patient ear. "By spring, they will know what the mountain tried to tell them. The only question is how many will be alive to remember the lesson." Willow nickered softly, her breath steaming in the already frigid October air, and somewhere in the distant peaks, the first true storm of the killing winter began to gather its strength. November crept forward with the patience of a predator certain of its kill. The temperatures that had seemed brutal on the 3rd of the month revealed themselves as mere warnings, gentle compared to what followed. By the 10th, the thermometer outside the land office had ceased to function entirely. The mercury contracted into a silver ball at the bottom of the tube that refused to rise regardless of how much Hosea Calloway shook the instrument and cursed at it. The old-timers stopped gathering on the boardwalk because the cold burned exposed skin within minutes, and the smoke from cabin chimneys rose straight up into the motionless air like gray columns supporting an invisible ceiling of ice. Rosalind Ridgway spent those early November days in constant motion, driven by a certainty that had settled into her bones alongside the cold. She had learned long ago that survival was not a matter of luck, but of preparation, and preparation was not a single grand gesture, but 1,000 small acts performed with relentless attention to detail. The root cellar required reorganization. 800 pounds of preserved vegetables sat in careful arrangement, but she needed to ensure the most perishable items remained accessible while the longest-keeping stores protected the back. She spent an entire day shifting the sand-packed carrots to the front chamber where she could reach them easily, moving the straw-bedded potatoes deeper into the 52-degree constant of the inner room where they would keep until spring without sprouting. The braided onions she rehung at the precise height that would allow air circulation without risking frost damage near the entrance. Her smoked meats hung from iron hooks in the cold room, and she counted them again as she had counted them 3 times already that week. 27 pounds of venison, 18 pounds of elk, 14 pounds of rabbit, and 6 pounds of wild turkey that she had bartered from a trapper passing through in September. The meat would last a single person through 5 months of winter. She had planned for one. The preparations she began now assumed something different. The firewood stacked against the cliff face outside her entrance represented 2 full years of gathering and splitting. She had cut it herself, mostly fallen timber from the slopes above, dried and seasoned and split into pieces small enough to burn hot and clean. 4 cords by her estimation, enough to maintain a fire continuously for 4 months if she burned sparingly. But again, she had planned for one. Now she looked at the wood and began calculating differently. On the 12th of November, she walked down to the settlement with the intent of purchasing additional supplies. The general store, operated by Ezekiel Marsh, occupied the center of the main street, a two-story building with living quarters above and merchandise below. Rosalind climbed the steps, stamped the snow from her boots, and entered to find the store nearly empty of customers. The cold had driven even the most determined shoppers home. Ezekiel Marsh looked up from behind his counter, and his expression shifted in the particular way it always did when she appeared. Not quite hostility, but something colder than indifference. He was a thin man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose, and he had been married to the widow Marsh for 30 years before apoplexy took him 6 years prior. His mother, 73 years old and sharp-tongued as a woman half her age, still lived in the small cabin at the edge of town where she had raised 4 children and buried 2. "Cash in advance," he said before she had taken 3 steps into the store. "You know the arrangement." Rosalind did know. She had known for 8 years, ever since Patience Calloway had suggested to the merchants of Ridgerest that the orphan cave dweller represented a credit risk that respectable businesses could not afford. She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew the small leather purse that contained her savings, such as they were. "I need salt," she said. 20 pounds, and another 25 pounds of cornmeal. And if you have any dried beans remaining, I will take whatever you can spare. Marsh's eyebrows rose. "Planning on feeding an army up in that hole of yours?" "Planning on surviving," Rosalind replied. "I would recommend you consider doing the same." She felt a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction when his expression faltered, but she suppressed it. Her grandfather had taught her that pride was a luxury the mountains did not forgive, and that the wise survivor never wasted energy on those who refused to learn. The salt cost her 40 cents, the cornmeal 75 cents, and the beans, 14 pounds of them representing nearly the last of the store's supply, ran her another 68 cents. She paid in coin, watched Marsh count it twice as if expecting her to have shorted him, and gathered her purchases into the canvas sack she had brought for the purpose. She was nearly to the door when the bell above it jingled, and Hosea Calloway entered, bringing with him a gust of frozen air and the particular energy of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. "Well, well," he said, stopping short when he saw her. "If it is not our resident badger, emerged from her burrow to grace us with her presence." He turned to Marsh with a theatrical expression of concern. "Ezekiel, I do hope you checked her money for bite marks. One never knows what strange habits develop when one lives alone in a cave for 8 years. Marsh chuckled, the sound forced but cooperative. Rosalind stood very still, her canvas sack heavy on her shoulder, and waited. Calloway was not finished. He rarely was. "I was just telling Patience this morning," he continued, his voice carrying with the practiced projection of a man accustomed to having audiences, "that we really ought to organize some sort of charitable intervention for the poor girl. 8 years she has been living like an animal, and now she thinks she can predict the weather better than the farmer's almanac." He shook his head with exaggerated pity. "I fear the isolation has affected her mind. First, she tells Henrik the winter will kill. Now she is likely down here buying provisions for the end times. Next, she will be building an ark and filling it with 2 of every chipmunk." The laughter this time came from both men, echoing in the near-empty store. Rosalind adjusted the sack on her shoulder and met Calloway's eyes. They were small eyes, set deep in a face that had grown florid with good living and self-satisfaction, and they held the particular cruelty of a man who had never been required to question his own opinions. "Tell me, Mr. Calloway," she said, her voice level as the surveying tool her grandfather had taught her to use, "how thick is the roof on your land office?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What sort of foolish question is that?" "The sort that has an answer," Rosalind said. I would guess from looking at it that your roof beams are standard 4x8 pine, spaced 2 feet apart, with a load capacity designed for perhaps 3 feet of wet snow. Is that about right? Calloway's smile flickered. I have no idea what you are babbling about. The Farmer's Almanac you mentioned, Rosalind continued, predicts a mild winter, normal snowfall, a pleasant spring. But the Farmer's Almanac does not watch the elk descend 6 weeks early, or measure the thickness of beaver lodges, or observe how the horses grow coats 3 times their normal density. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Your roof will hold until Christmas, perhaps. After that, you should pray the almanac is right, because if I am right, you will not have a roof by New Year's. She walked past him out the door and into the killing cold, leaving behind a silence that lasted nearly a full minute before Calloway recovered enough to laugh. Did you hear that, Ezekiel? The Badger is not merely a prophet now, she is an engineer as well, calculating load capacities on buildings she has never entered. He laughed again, louder, more deliberately. I tell you, we should start charging admission to hear her predictions. The Ridgerest Oracle, reading the future in beaver dams and horsehair. 2 bits of prophecy, satisfaction guaranteed, or your money back. The story spread through Ridgerest by nightfall, gaining embellishments with each telling. By the time it reached the saloon, Rosalind had become not merely eccentric, but actively dangerous, the sort of disturbed hermit who made threats against upstanding citizens' property. Hosea Calloway told the tale 3 times that evening, each version more elaborate than the last, and the laughter grew louder with each repetition. Now, friend, if you are wondering whether Rosalind was right about those roof beams, stay with this story, and you will find out exactly what happened when the weight of winter came calling. The following Sunday, the Women's Sewing Circle gathered at the Calloway residence as they did each week, 23 women representing the respectable families of Ridgerest. Patience Calloway presided over these gatherings with the air of a woman who understood that social organization was itself a form of power, and she exercised that power with careful precision. I have heard the most distressing news, she announced once the tea had been poured and the quilting frames arranged. It seems the Ridgway girl has taken to making public threats against my husband's business establishment. A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Threats? Asked Martha Pine, a tired woman with 7 children and a husband who spent more time with his cattle than his family. What sort of threats? She walked into the general store bold as brass, Patience continued, and told poor Ezekiel Marsh that Hosea's roof would collapse by New Year's, in front of witnesses. Can you imagine the malice required to say such a thing? The murmuring intensified. Several women shook their heads in disapproval. I've always said there was something wrong with that girl, offered Elizabeth Wheeler, bouncing her infant daughter Constance on her knee. Living alone in a cave at her age. No chaperone, no family, no supervision of any kind. It is not natural. It is worse than not natural, Patience said, warming to her theme. It is unwholesome. And I think it is time we made certain the younger women of our community understand the dangers of associating with such influences. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each woman in turn. I propose that we make it understood, in no uncertain terms, that any woman who is seen visiting that cave dwelling, or speaking with the Ridgway girl in any capacity beyond the minimal requirements of commerce, will no longer be welcome at our gatherings. A few women shifted uncomfortably. Martha Pine opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Are we in agreement? Patience asked. 22 heads nodded. The motion carried without formal vote, as most things did when Patience Calloway desired them. Word of the decree reached Rosalind through the wife of the blacksmith, one of the few women who had never entirely accepted the sewing circle's rulings. She delivered the news while purchasing a repaired bridle from Rosalind's small, leatherworking trade, speaking quickly and quietly as if afraid of being overheard. "I thought you should know," the woman said. "I'm not saying I agree with it, mind, but it is what they have decided." Rosalind accepted the information with a nod. "Thank you for telling me. Are you not upset?" Rosalind considered the question. The social exclusion had existed in one form or another since her arrival in Ridgerest. This formalization changed nothing practical, merely made explicit what had always been implicit. But the blacksmith's wife seemed to expect some reaction, so Rosalind offered one. "Let them gather in their warm parlors and talk," she said. "By spring, they will have learned what I tried to teach them. I only hope the lesson does not cost too many lives." The blacksmith's wife left, looking troubled, and Rosalind did not see her again until the snow had claimed its first victims. That evening, Rosalind stood in her doorway as the sun descended behind the western peaks, painting the snow-covered valley in the shades of rose and amber that seemed too beautiful for the deadly cold they concealed. Willow stood in her corral, her breath steaming, her ears pricked forward as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Rosalind walked to the mare and stood beside her, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from the animal's thick coat. She reached up and rubbed the spot behind Willow's ears where the horse liked to be scratched, and she spoke aloud in a way she rarely did, her voice carrying no further than the two of them. "They have decided I am dangerous now," she said. "Not merely strange, not merely eccentric, but actively threatening. Patience Calloway has organized them against me as efficiently as she organizes her quilting patterns." She paused, her hand stilling on the mare's neck. "I wonder sometimes if my grandfather felt this way, in the weeks before the collapse. He knew the supports were failing, you see." Willow turned her head and pressed her nose against Rosalind's shoulder, a gesture of equine comfort that needed no translation. "The difference is that they could not leave," Rosalind continued. "They needed the work. The company owned their housing, their credit at the store, their very ability to feed their families. They were trapped in a mountain that was going to kill them, and everyone knew it, and no one would listen." She looked out over the valley, where the last light was fading from the peaks. "These people have choices. They could prepare, they could build shelter, they could store provisions. They could listen to what the land is telling them if only they would open their ears. But they would rather laugh at the girl who lives in a cave than admit she might know something they do not." She fell silent for a long moment, watching the darkness gather. 41 below, she said finally, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "That is what is coming. Maybe colder. For weeks, perhaps months. The elk know it. The beavers know it. You know it. Do you not, old girl? Your coat tells the story as clearly as any prophecy." She pressed her forehead against the horse's warm neck. "Some of them will die. I cannot prevent that. The widow Marsh, who never leaves her cabin even in good weather. The young ones whose parents have not laid in enough fuel. The stubborn ones who will venture out when they should stay home. They will die because they would rather believe the farmer's almanac than the evidence before their eyes." Willow nickered softly, and Rosalind straightened. "But some of them will survive," she said, her voice firming, "because I will not let them all freeze while I sit comfortable in my stone fortress. When the worst comes, and it will come, they will remember that the badger has a warm burrow. And I will let them in, every last one of them, including Hosea Calloway himself. My grandfather would expect nothing less." She patted the mare's neck one final time and returned to her cave, closing the heavy oak door against the night. Inside, the fire crackled in its stone hearth, sending waves of warmth through chambers that the outside cold could not penetrate. Rosalind settled into her grandfather's chair, one of the few pieces of furniture she had brought from Pennsylvania, and watched the flames dance their ancient patterns. "The mountains told me," she said to the empty room, completing a thought that had been forming for days. "I told them. They would not listen. But by spring, we will all know together." The days that followed brought no relief from the cold, but neither did they bring the killing blow that Rosalind knew was gathering strength somewhere beyond the peaks. This was the deceptive calm, the moment when weaker souls began to believe that perhaps the worst had passed, that their initial fears had been exaggerated. The thermometer outside the land office began functioning again around the 20th of November, when the temperature rose to a mere 15 below, and Hosea Calloway made a point of announcing at the saloon that the terrible cold spell was clearly ending. "Nothing but a bit of early weather," he declared, his confidence restored now that he could no longer see his breath forming ice crystals in the air. The Badger predicted a killing winter, and look at us, all still alive and thriving. Perhaps we should ask her to predict the winner of next year's horse race. She seems to have about the same accuracy. The laughter that greeted this pronouncement was loud and long, but Rosalind, watching from her cliffside vantage point, saw what the townspeople refused to see. The elk had not returned to the high country. The beaver lodges remained sealed tight, their inhabitants invisible and waiting. Willow's coat showed no sign of thinning, remaining as dense as armor against something yet to come. And in the northeastern sky, just beyond the highest peaks, clouds were gathering with a weight and darkness that spoke of something gathering its strength for an assault that would make the early November cold seem like a gentle warning. She checked her stores one final time, counted her firewood again, examined every seam of her oak door for drafts that might need to be sealed. And she waited because waiting was all that remained for those who had prepared, and all that remained for those who had not was prayer. Now pause here, friend, and consider what it means to know that disaster is coming and have no one believe you. If this story moves you, hit subscribe and join us to see what happens when the mountain finally speaks loud enough for everyone to hear. November ended not with the gradual warming that the townspeople had begun to expect, but with a single night that announced the true winter with the voice of a howling demon. The wind began after midnight on the 30th, screaming down from the peaks with a fury that had not been heard in living memory. It caught doors and tore them from hinges. It found every crack in every cabin and drove the cold inside like an invading army. It swept the snow from the exposed ground and piled it against the eastern walls of buildings in drifts that reached the eaves by dawn. When morning came, the thermometer outside the land office read 34 degrees below zero, and by noon it had dropped to 38. The cold was no longer passive, no longer merely present. It had become a predator, actively hunting the warmth of living things, finding ways through wool and leather and timber to reach the vulnerable flesh beneath. That first day of December, no one ventured outside except from absolute necessity. The smoke from cabin chimneys bent horizontal in the wind before being torn apart and scattered, providing little evidence that warmth existed anywhere in the frozen valley. Cattle died where they stood in their stalls, their owners unable to reach them through the wind-driven snow. Horses screamed in their inadequate shelters, and some broke free and fled into the white void, never to be seen again. Rosalind watched from the shelter of her cave entrance, the heavy oak door cracked just enough to observe. The wind howled past her doorway but could not penetrate the stone that surrounded her. The temperature inside held steady at 52 degrees, as it had held for the past 3 years, indifferent to the fury raging beyond. Willow stood pressed against the cliff face in her sheltered corral, calm despite the chaos, her thick coat shedding snow that could not touch her skin. "It begins," Rosalind said, and closed the door against the wind. The killing winter had arrived. The killing winter did not relent. December's first week brought temperatures that the settlement's oldest residents had never witnessed, cold so profound that it seemed to possess intelligence and malice. The thermometer outside the land office, when anyone dared venture close enough to read it, showed 41 degrees below zero on the morning of December 3rd. By December 5th, the mercury had retreated entirely into the bulb, refusing to register temperatures that exceeded its capacity to measure. The cold had become something beyond human reckoning, a force that defied the instruments designed to quantify it. The wind continued its assault without pause, varying only in intensity from merely brutal to actively murderous. It found gaps in cabin walls that had seemed secure for years. It drove snow through the smallest openings with the pressure of water through a broken dam. It created drifts that buried the lower windows of single-story buildings and reached the roof lines of others, transforming the familiar landscape of Ridgerest into an alien terrain of white peaks and valleys that bore no resemblance to the settlement anyone remembered. Hosea Calloway's land office was among the first structures to fail. The building had been constructed in the boom years of 1882, when speculation in Montana Territory land had seemed a path to certain wealth. Calloway had spared no expense on the facade, importing carved wooden trim from St. Louis and installing windows of genuine plate glass that had cost more than most miners earned in a month. The roof, however, had been built to the minimum standard, with rafters spaced for economy rather than strength, covered with shingles that had been the cheapest available at the time of construction. The weight of the snow accumulated steadily through the first week of December, pressing down with patient inevitability. On the morning of December 8th, while Calloway huddled with his wife and 3 children in the living quarters behind the office, a sound like cannon fire announced the failure of the main roof beam. The entire structure sagged inward, then collapsed in a cascade of timber, shingles, and 8 years of accumulated property records. Calloway and his family escaped through a rear window, carrying nothing but the clothes they wore and the bitter knowledge that everything he had built was now buried beneath tons of snow and splintered wood. The safe containing his cash reserves remained entombed somewhere in the wreckage, unreachable until spring, if it could be found at all. Calloway stood in the howling wind, watching the ruin of his ambitions, his face exposed to cold that began freezing his cheeks within minutes. His wife, Patience, pulled him toward their neighbor's cabin, and he followed without resistance, a man who had lost not merely property, but the certainty that had defined his existence. The man who had mocked the badger's burrow now found himself without any burrow at all. The general store fared little better. Ezekiel Marsh had built solid walls, but he had filled his shelves for a normal winter, not for a siege. By December 10th, the flour was gone. By December 12th, the cornmeal. By the 15th, desperate families were paying $3 for a single pound of salt pork that had sold for 30 cents a month earlier. Marsh charged what the market would bear, telling himself he was merely following the laws of supply and demand, but his thin face grew thinner with each transaction, and his crooked spectacles reflected eyes that could not meet those of the families counting their last coins. By December 20th, his shelves stood empty. The store that had required Rosalind to pay cash while extending credit to everyone else now had nothing to sell at any price. The widow Marsh died on Christmas Eve. Ezekiel found her in the morning, seated in her rocker by a cold stove, her hands folded in her lap as if she had simply decided to rest. The fire had burned down to ash sometime in the night, and she had not risen to add fuel. Perhaps she had been too weak. Perhaps the cold had crept into her bones so gradually that she had not noticed the transition from sleep to death. She was 73 years old, and she had lived long enough to bury 2 of her 4 children. But she had not lived long enough to see another spring. Her son could not dig a grave. The ground was frozen to a depth beyond any shovel's reach. He wrapped her in the quilt she had made for her wedding night 60 years before and placed her in the small shed behind his store, where the cold would preserve her until the earth softened enough to receive her properly. He told no one. He simply returned to his empty store and sat behind his counter staring at shelves that had nothing left to offer. The Pine family suffered their loss on New Year's Day. Samuel Pine was 14 years old enough to consider himself a man, old enough to feel responsible for the family's scattered cattle. His father had not returned from the range since the storm began, and his mother Martha's eyes held a grief that suggested she knew why. The cattle represented the family's entire wealth, their only hope of surviving the year ahead, and Samuel could not bear to watch his mother's face when she looked at the empty corral where 8 animals should have stood. He left before dawn, telling no one, following tracks that the wind had already half filled with fresh snow. He found one heifer dead in a draw, frozen where she had sought shelter from the wind. He found another standing motionless in a drift, ice coating her hide so thickly that she seemed transformed into a statue of herself. He tried to drive her home, but she would not move, could not move, and his own hands had grown so numb that he could no longer feel whether he still held the rope. They found him that evening, 2 miles from the house, curled around the frozen heifer as if his body heat could somehow bring her back to life. His eyes were open, staring at something beyond the white sky, and his face held an expression of profound surprise, as if death had arrived wearing a mask he had not expected. Martha Pine did not scream when they brought him home. She did not weep. She simply gathered her remaining 6 children around her and held them in silence, her tired face transformed into something harder and older than it had been that morning. Baby Constance Wheeler never saw her first birthday. The Wheeler cabin had seemed solid enough when James Wheeler built it 3 years before, but he had not anticipated a winter that would crack the mortar around the chimney and allow snow to sift down into the flue. On the night of January 3rd, the fire that should have warmed his family instead filled the cabin with smoke that could not escape. Elizabeth Wheeler woke coughing, disoriented, and struggled through the haze to find her daughter's cradle. The baby was not breathing. The doctor, who had frozen his fingers badly the week before and could barely hold his instruments, said that the smoke had been peaceful, that the child had simply stopped breathing without waking, without suffering. Elizabeth Wheeler heard his words without understanding them. She held the small body against her chest and rocked, humming a lullaby that her daughter would never hear again, while her husband stood helpless beside her, unable to offer comfort that did not exist. Now pause here, friend, and consider the weight of this truth, that the deaths of winter fall hardest on those least able to defend themselves. If you have been touched by loss, you know that the cold can find us anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and walk with us through the valley of shadows toward the light that waits beyond. The killing winter continued its harvest through January and into February, claiming the weak, the unprepared, and the merely unlucky with equal indifference. The settlement that had numbered 243 souls in November counted its survivors by firelight, and the numbers grew smaller with each passing week. Throughout this season of death, Rosalind Ridgway thrived. The word is not chosen carelessly. While her neighbors froze and starved and watched their children die, Rosalind lived in her cave at a constant 52 degrees, eating venison she had smoked in October, warming herself by a fire fed with wood she had cut in September. Willow stood fat and content in her sheltered corral, her thick coat shedding snow that could not touch her, her hay supply sufficient to see her through to grass. The contrast was not merely stark, it was obscene, a living rebuke to everyone who had mocked the badger's burrow. She did not gloat. She did not remind anyone of her warnings. She simply lived, tending her fire, reading books her grandfather had given her, waiting for what she knew must eventually come. The approach came on February 14th. The wind had finally died to something that could be endured, though the temperature remained 23 degrees below zero. Rosalind was outside her cave, checking Willow's water bucket and breaking the ice that had formed overnight, when she saw the small figure struggling up the slope toward her door. It was a child, perhaps 8 years old, bundled so heavily in layers of clothing that Rosalind could not immediately determine whether it was a boy or girl. The child moved with the careful deliberation of someone at the edge of exhaustion, placing each foot precisely, pausing between steps to gather strength for the next. Rosalind set down the bucket and walked down to meet the approaching figure. It was a girl. She saw as she drew closer, with a face reddened by cold and eyes that held more grief than any child should be required to carry. One of the Pine children, Rosalind realized, recognizing the shape of the jaw that matched Martha's, the color of the eyes that had belonged to young Samuel. The girl stopped when Rosalind reached her, looking up with an expression that held no hope, no expectation, only a determination that had clearly cost her everything she had remaining. "Mama sent me," she said. Her voice was barely audible, scraped raw by cold and exhaustion. "She said to ask if you had room." Now here is something to notice, friend. The girl did not beg. Martha Pine had not sent her daughter to grovel before the woman the town had mocked. She had sent a simple question, a request that acknowledged dignity on both sides. If this story teaches you anything about how to ask for help, carry that lesson with you. And if you want to see how help can be given with equal dignity, stay with us. Like this video and hit that bell, because the best part of this story is still ahead. Rosalind looked at the child, seeing the hollows in her cheeks that spoke of insufficient food, the trembling in her limbs that came from more than cold. She saw Martha Pine's face in this small messenger, the same tired determination, the same refusal to surrender despite everything that had been taken. "What is your name?" Rosalind asked. "Hannah. Hannah Pine." "How many are in your family now, Hannah?" The girl's eyes flickered with something that might have been pain. "6 of us children. And Mama. Papa has not come home. 7 souls. 7 people who needed warmth, food, shelter from a winter that had already killed so many." Rosalind thought of her stores, calculated mentally the provisions she had laid in for one person for one winter. 800 pounds of vegetables, nearly 70 pounds of smoked meat, 20 pounds of salt, 25 of cornmeal, 14 of beans, 4 cords of firewood. Enough for one person for 5 months, she had calculated. For 8 people, the numbers changed dramatically. But mathematics was not the only consideration, and Rosalind had learned long ago that some equations could not be solved on paper. "Tell your mother to bring everyone who can walk," she said. "Tell her to bring whatever food remains in your cabin, whatever blankets can be carried. Tell her I have room by the fire for all of you." Hannah Pine's face did not change expression. She had come expecting rejection, had prepared herself for the cruelty that adults so often showed, and this simple acceptance seemed beyond her ability to process. "You will let us come inside?" she asked. "I will teach you how to stay warm," Rosalind said. "That is better than letting you inside. That is giving you something you can keep forever." She took the child's frozen hand and led her up the slope toward the oak door, toward the warmth that waited beyond, toward the beginning of something that neither of them could yet imagine. The Pine family arrived that afternoon, Martha leading her children in a single file through the snow, each carrying what they could manage. The youngest rode on his mother's back, too small to walk the distance. The oldest, a boy of 16, who had inherited his father's silence, carried a sack of flour that weighed perhaps 20 pounds, all that remained of the family's food stores. Rosalind met them at the door and did not waste time with welcomes. "Inside," she said. "Warmth first, then we will organize." The cave swallowed them, and the killing winter's claim on the Pine family came to an end. The Pine family filled the cave with breath and presence, 7 bodies crowding into space that had known only one for 8 years. Rosalind did not pause to consider the strangeness of it, the sudden transformation of solitude into community. There was too much to be done. "Children against the back wall," she said, her voice carrying the same calm authority her grandfather had used when organizing rescue parties after partial collapses. "The stone there holds the most heat. Martha, you and I will inventory what remains of your supplies against what I have stored." The flour the oldest Pine boy had carried weighed closer to 18 pounds when Rosalind hefted the sack. Combined with what she had laid in, it would stretch further than she had initially calculated. The mathematics of survival were harsh but honest. 8 mouths instead of 1 meant her 5 months of provisions became something closer to 3 weeks of comfortable eating, or 6 weeks of careful rationing. But rationing assumed isolation, assumed that the cold would hold forever, assumed that no other help would come. Rosalind had been assuming wrong things her entire life. She had assumed her grandfather would always be there to teach her. She had assumed the mine owners would listen to his warnings. She had assumed her mother's heart would keep beating. The killing winter had proved that assumptions meant nothing against reality, but it had also proved that preparation meant everything. "We will need to organize sleeping in shifts," she told Martha, who stood near the entrance with her youngest child still clinging to her back. "The inner chamber stays warmest, but it cannot hold all of us at once. 4 will sleep while 3 remain in the main room, tending the fire and preparing food. We will rotate every 4 hours." Martha Pine's tired face showed the first flicker of something that might have been hope. "You have done this before. Organized people in crisis." "My grandfather organized rescue parties after cave-ins. He taught me that panic kills faster than cold, and order saves faster than luck." Rosalind gestured toward the root cellar carved into the side wall. 800 pounds of vegetables, 70 pounds of smoked meat, enough salt and cornmeal and beans to see us through if we are careful. The spring in the back chamber runs clean year-round. We will not starve, and we will not freeze. The children had pressed themselves against the warm stone of the back wall as instructed, their small bodies gradually relaxing as the constant temperature of the cave began to penetrate their frozen clothing. Hannah, the girl who had made the desperate climb to ask for help, watched Rosalind with eyes that held a new kind of attention, the focused observation of someone learning something important. "Why did you let us come?" she asked. "Everyone in town said you would never help anyone. They said you were strange and mean, and wanted to live alone forever." Rosalind knelt beside the girl, bringing their eyes level. "Do you know why I live in this cave, Hannah?" The girl shook her head. "Because my grandfather taught me that the earth can shelter us if we learn to listen to it. He died in a mine collapse when the owners refused to hear his warnings about failing supports. He knew the danger was coming, just as I knew this winter was coming. But knowing something means nothing if no one will listen." She touched the stone wall beside them, feeling its steady warmth against her palm. "I did not want to live alone. I wanted to live safely. Those are different things." Hannah considered this with the gravity that children bring to truths they sense are important. "Mama listened," she said finally. "When you told Mr. Yost about the winter, she heard about it from the saloon talk. She wanted to do what you did, but Papa said it was foolishness. Your father is a cattleman. He trusted his cattle to survive as they always had." Rosalind kept her voice neutral, offering no judgment. "The winter proved stronger than anyone's trust." Martha Pine had been listening from across the chamber. "My husband rode out to check the herd on the 4th day of December," she said quietly. "He never came back. The snow covered any trail he might have left. By the time anyone could search, there was nothing to find. Rosalind met the woman's eyes and saw there the same grief she had carried from Pennsylvania, the same weight of loss that never fully lifted. "Then you and I understand each other," she said simply. "We have both buried people who deserved better. The only question is what we do with the living." Word spread through the settlement in the way that news travels in small communities, passed from mouth to mouth despite the killing cold that made any travel dangerous. The Pine family had gone to the cave creature. The badger had taken them in. Some heard this news with disbelief, others with contempt, and a few with something that might have been the first stirrings of desperate hope. By the end of February, 3 more families had made the climb to Rosalind's door. She organized them with the same calm efficiency she had shown the Pines, teaching as she sheltered, demonstrating the techniques her grandfather had passed to her. She showed them how to build snow caves with proper ventilation, how to angle the entrance so cold air would pool in a pit below the sleeping platform rather than settling over the bodies of the sleepers. She taught them which stones held heat longest and how to warm rocks in the fire, then bury them in the straw beneath their bedrolls. She explained why wool retained warmth even when wet while cotton killed, and she watched her students carry these lessons back to whatever shelter they could find. The teaching mattered more than the sharing. Anyone could give away food, she knew. Her grandfather had taught her that charity without knowledge was kindness with an expiration date. But wisdom, once given, could not be taken back. The family she taught would survive this winter, and they would survive the next, and the one after that. The earth did not change its nature because men chose to ignore it. Learn its lessons once, and they held forever. The spring thaw began in late March when the temperature finally crept above zero for the first time in 119 days. The snow did not melt so much as it surrendered, collapsing in on itself as if exhausted by its long occupation. Bitter Creek roared with meltwater, flooding its banks and carrying the debris of the killing winter downstream, wooden planks from collapsed buildings and the bloated bodies of cattle that had frozen where they stood. The settlement emerged from its long nightmare to count what remained. Of the 243 souls who had called Ridge Arrest home in November, 41 had died. Some, like Widow Marsh and baby Constance Wheeler, had succumbed to the cold itself, frozen in their beds or suffocated by smoke from failed chimneys. Others, like Samuel Pine, had died searching for livestock that was already dead. A few had simply given up, their hearts stopping from exhaustion and despair, unable to imagine another dawn of the same relentless cold. Hosea Calloway had not died, though his fortune had. The land office he had built in 1882, with its imported trim from St. Louis and its brass fittings and its roof constructed of timber too thin to bear the weight of ice, had collapsed entirely on December 8th. 8 years of property records were destroyed. Deeds and surveys and the careful documentation of his speculative empire reduced to pulp beneath the crushing snow. The man who had laughed as he sold a cliff face to an orphan girl now stood in the ruins of his ambition, owner of nothing but debts. The gathering came in April. It began without announcement, without formal invitation. People simply started walking toward the cliff face above Bitter Creek, climbing the path that had become worn smooth by the passage of refugees throughout the winter. They came in ones and twos at first, then in family groups, then in clusters that approached something like crowds. By mid-morning, 37 survivors stood on the flat ground before the oak door of the dwelling they had mocked for 8 years, waiting for something none of them could have named. Rosalind emerged to find them there, these neighbors who had excluded her and ridiculed her and required her to pay cash while extending credit to each other. She saw Patience Calloway in the crowd, the woman who had organized her ostracism from the sewing circle. She saw Ezekiel Marsh, the general store owner who had demanded payment in advance as if she were a vagrant rather than a landowner. She saw Elizabeth Wheeler, who still carried her grief for baby Constance like a physical weight. And she saw Henrik Joost, the blacksmith who had repeated her warnings as a joke. She saw Hosea Calloway at the front of the gathering, his politician's smile gone, his speculator's confidence shattered. He looked older than his years, aged by a winter that had stripped away everything he had built on other people's desperation. He spoke first. His voice cracked on the opening syllables, and he had to begin again. "I stood on the land office steps 8 years ago," he said, "and I called this place the Badger's Burrow. I said that the Ridgway girl had gone full animal, that she would be eating grubs and sleeping in her own filth." The words came slowly, as if each one cost him something he could not afford to pay. "I laughed when I sold her land I thought was worthless. I laughed when she began blasting into the cliff. I laughed at every progress she made because laughing at her made me feel important." He paused, gathering himself for what came next. "When the killing winter came, everything I had built fell apart. My roof collapsed. My records were destroyed. My savings went to buy flour at $3 a pound while I watched my children grow thin. I had nothing left but my pride, and my pride would not keep anyone warm." Tears ran down his weathered face, freezing in his beard before they could fall. "My wife and children survived because this woman, this girl I mocked and cheated and tried to drive from our community, took them in when I could not. She fed them from stores she had laid in while I was laughing. She taught them skills that will serve them for the rest of their lives." He turned to face Rosalind directly, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "Miss Ridgway, I have been a fool, and worse than a fool. I have been cruel to someone who deserved kindness and blind to wisdom that was offered freely. I do not expect you to forgive me, but I must ask for my own soul's sake. Can you find it in your heart to pardon what I have done?" Rosalind did not respond. She waited, her slate-gray eyes moving across the gathered crowd. Patience Calloway stepped forward next. Her face, which had always been arranged in expressions of genteel superiority, now showed the ravages of a winter that cared nothing for social standing. "I organized the women's sewing circle to exclude you," she said, her voice tight with shame. "I called you the cave creature. I said you were not fit company for decent women. I told Elizabeth Wheeler not to let her children play near your land because your strangeness might be catching." She pressed her hands together as if in prayer, though no church had ever heard this kind of confession. "When the cold came, I learned what strangeness truly meant. It meant being prepared when preparation seemed foolish. It meant listening to warnings when everyone else laughed them away. It meant surviving when survival was impossible." She looked at her husband, then back at Rosalind. "You took in my children. You fed them when our own stores ran out. You taught my daughter how to build a snow cave, and that knowledge saved 2 other families when your main chamber was already full. I have been cruel and petty and small, and you responded with generosity I did not deserve." Her voice broke. "I ask your forgiveness, knowing I have no right to receive it." Ezekiel Marsh came forward without waiting for Rosalind to respond to the first 2 confessions. His crooked spectacles sat at an angle on his thin face, and his hands trembled visibly. "I required you to pay cash in advance," he said. "I told everyone it was because I could not be certain you would survive to pay your debts, but that was a lie. I did it because Hosea Calloway asked me to, because going along with powerful people has always been easier than standing alone." His voice dropped lower. "My mother died on Christmas Eve. She froze in her rocker 3 feet from a cold stove because I did not check on her often enough, because I was too busy worrying about my store and my standing and my reputation. Widow Marsh raised 4 children and buried 2, and she deserved better than to die alone in the cold." He removed his spectacles and wiped his eyes with a shaking hand. "You did not know my mother well. She was not kind to you either. But when you heard she had died, you came to the funeral. You were the only person outside the family who made the climb through the snow to stand at her grave. I've asked myself every day since why you would do that for a woman who had never done anything for you. He replaced his spectacles and met Rosalind's eyes. I believe, now, that kindness does not require being earned. I believe it is simply what decent people do. I have not been a decent person, Miss Ridgway. I would like to learn how. Henrik Joost, the blacksmith, spoke last among the confessors. He was a large man, his arms thick with the muscle of his trade, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder. You told me the winter would kill. You stood in my shop and spoke the truth, and I carried that truth to the saloon like it was a joke. I helped make you a laughingstock because it was easier than believing a young woman might know something I did not. He looked down at his massive hands. 14 people died in Ridgerest this winter. Would any of them have lived if we had listened? I cannot know, but I know that I will carry the weight of that question for the rest of my life. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply stood there, letting his words settle into the silence. Now, friend, listen carefully to what comes next. If you have ever been mocked for seeing what others refuse to see, if you have ever held wisdom that no one would hear, this is for you. Subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to know that vindication sometimes comes wrapped in tragedy. The gathered crowd waited. They had spoken their confessions. They had asked for absolution. Now they looked to Rosalind Ridgway, this 19-year-old woman who had built a fortress while they laughed, who had survived while they nearly perished, who had saved many of their lives while owing them nothing. Rosalind let the silence stretch. She looked at each face in turn, reading the grief and shame and desperate hope written there. She thought of her grandfather, whose warnings had been ignored by mine owners who cared more about profits than lives. She thought of her mother, whose heart had stopped because grief was heavier than any body could bear. She thought of young Samuel Pine, who had died searching for cattle that were already dead, and baby Constance Wheeler, who had never seen her first birthday. Finally, she spoke. My grandfather used to say that the earth forgives everyone who learns to listen to her. He said it because he believed it, and he believed it because the mountains taught him. He died in a collapse that could have been prevented if the owners had listened to his warnings about failing supports. 47 men were buried that day. The company paid for the funerals and hired new workers the following week. That is what forgiveness without change looks like. It looks like more graves. She paused, letting her words settle. You ask me to forgive you, but forgiveness is not mine to give. The dead are the ones who suffered from your mockery and your blindness. Widow Marsh is the one who froze alone because no one checked on her. Samuel Pine is the one who died searching for cattle because his father trusted tradition over warning. Baby Constance Wheeler is the one who never grew old enough to understand why her parents wept over her small body. Her voice remained steady, without accusation but without softening. You cannot ask their forgiveness because they are not here to give it. You can only ask what you will do differently so that others do not join them. Hosea Calloway's face crumpled. Then there is no absolution? No way to make right what we did wrong? There is learning, Rosalind said. There is changing. There is building something better from the ruins of what failed. She gestured toward the cliff face around her, the sandstone dwelling that had sheltered so many through the killing winter. My grandfather did not teach me to carve this cave so I could survive alone. He taught me so I would have something to pass on. Knowledge is not meant to be hoarded. It is meant to be shared. She looked at the crowd, at the faces of people who had excluded her and mocked her and tried to break her. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. I will show you how to read the signs the animals give when hard weather is coming. I will teach you how stone holds warmth and how a hillside can become a fortress. I will share every lesson my grandfather passed to me, freely and without price, because that is what he would have wanted. The weight of her words settled over the gathering like a blessing and a burden together. This was not the cheap absolution they had hoped for. This was something harder and more valuable, a chance to become different people than they had been. The mountain listened when you would not, Rosalind finished. Now you will have the opportunity to learn what it was trying to say. The years that followed transformed Ridgerest in ways that no one could have predicted. In the first summer after the killing winter, Hosea Calloway apprenticed himself to Rosalind Ridgway. The man who had laughed as he sold her worthless land now knelt beside her with surveying tools in his hands, learning to read the layers in stone that indicated structural integrity. He never fully mastered the techniques, his hands too accustomed to paperwork and speculation, but his children learned, and their children after them. By 1900, 17 cliff dwellings dotted the hills around Ridgerest, each one carved according to the principles Rosalind taught. Some were simple, a single room extending 20 feet into the rock. Others were elaborate, multi-chambered complexes that housed extended families through generations. The term Badger wisdom entered the local vocabulary, transforming from mockery into reverence, becoming the shorthand for practical knowledge that fools dismissed until reality proved them wrong. Patience Calloway never fully recovered her social standing, nor did she seek to. She spent her remaining years teaching younger women the lessons she had learned too late, about the dangers of exclusion and the blindness of pride. When she died in 1908, her gravestone read simply, "She learned to listen," and no one who knew her story questioned the epitaph. Henrik Joost, the blacksmith, became Rosalind's most devoted student. He learned to read weather signs with the same attention he brought to reading the color of heated iron, and he passed those skills to every apprentice who worked his forge. When travelers asked why the Ridgerest blacksmith spent so much time watching the sky and the animals, locals would explain with quiet pride that he practiced Badger wisdom. It was the highest compliment the community knew how to give. Willow, the buckskin mare who had grown such a thick coat in the autumn of '87, lived until 1902, an extraordinary age for a horse in that harsh climate. When she finally lay down and did not rise, Rosalind buried her in a grave carved into the cliff face beside the cave entrance, marking the spot with a smooth sandstone slab. The inscription read, "She knew before I did," and those who understood the story of the killing winter recognized the truth of those words. Rosalind Ridgway never married, though she was courted by several men who admired her resilience and her wisdom. She said once to a woman who asked why she remained alone, that she had found her family and the children she taught in the community she helped rebuild. By the time she was 40, nearly every person in Ridgerest under the age of 25 had spent at least one summer learning from her, absorbing the lessons her grandfather had taught in the hills above a Pennsylvania coal town. She adopted no children legally, but 3 generations called her grandmother regardless of blood. The Pine children, whom she had sheltered through that first desperate winter, named their own children after her, and those children named their children in turn. By 1930, there were more Rosalinds in Ridgerest than in any other settlement in Montana, each one carrying forward a name that had come to mean survival and generosity, and the refusal to let cruelty have the final word. Friend, if you have traveled this far with us through the killing winter and into the spring that followed, then you understand something about perseverance that no summary can teach. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of unlikely victory, and share this with someone who needs to hear that wisdom outlasts mockery every time. Rosalind Ridgway died in 1934, at the age of 66, in the cave dwelling she had carved beginning at age 11. She passed in her sleep on a February night, with 3 of her adopted grandchildren keeping vigil beside her bed and a fire burning steady in the stone hearth. The doctor who examined her said her heart had simply decided it had done enough, and no one who knew her story disagreed. Her funeral drew 400 mourners, nearly 3 times the population of Ridgerest itself. They came from across Montana and from states beyond, people who had learned from her or learned from those she taught, carrying forward the practical wisdom of a Welsh miner who had died 55 years before in a Pennsylvania coal mine. Hosea Calloway's grandson delivered the eulogy, speaking of redemption and second chances and the woman who had offered his family both when they deserved neither. The cave still stands. The Historical Society maintains it now, keeping the oak door fitted as precisely as Rosalind fitted it, oiling the hinges so they swing silent, preserving the root cellar and the spring-fed trough and the sleeping alcove where 3 generations slept safe from winters that killed less prepared souls. Visitors come from across the country to stand in that constant 52 degrees and imagine what it must have felt like to survive when survival seemed impossible. Above the oak door, carved in letters that Rosalind cut with her own hand in the summer of 1898, reads an inscription that few visitors fully understand. The mountains told me. I told you. Now we both know. The words seem simple, almost childish until you learn their history, until you understand that a Welsh miner named Dafydd Ridgway spent 30 years trying to teach his employers that the earth speaks to those who learn to listen, until you recognize that his granddaughter carried his wisdom across a continent and carved it into stone where it could never be ignored again. Dafydd Ridgway would have recognized every word. He would have traced the letters with his calloused fingers and smiled the particular smile of a teacher whose student has surpassed all expectations. He would have known that his lessons survived the mine collapse that killed him, survived the grief that stopped his daughter-in-law's heart, survived the long journey of an orphan girl who arrived in Montana with $17 and a surveying level and more wisdom than any child should need to carry. He would have understood that some knowledge cannot be buried, cannot be forgotten, cannot be silenced by mockery or exclusion or the cruelest winter in memory. The earth teaches those who listen, and those who listen teach others, and the chain stretches forward into a future that neither of them lived to see, but both of them made possible.